Welcome into Talking Sports with JP. It's week 5 of the college football season, and it's heating up. Unbeatens are starting to fall as they face off with one another. Some teams are being exposed and still winning, while others are being exposed for frauds. Without any delay, let's get into my top 7 this week. My top 4, Georgia, Michigan, Ohio State, and Texas for this week. The Bulldogs hold tight to the number 1 spot, mainly because what I see wrong with this team, I see wrong with every team, and that's consistently slow starts and an expectation of more. The Wolverines' win a week ago was a way better quality win than that of Georgia, but like I said, slow starts and underperformance does not move you up, and winning keeps you from dropping. Ohio State went into South Bend and took on a really good Irish team and was able to, be just one more man tougher than Notre Dame. Too soon? Nah, it's okay. Texas fell 1 this week because of the Buckeyes winning, which I didn't think was going to happen. And a win in South Bend over an undefeated Notre Dame team looks a lot better than the Longhorns' win in Waco over a 1-win Baylor team. 5 through 7, USC, Florida State, and Penn State. The Trojans both scare me and excite me watching them play. I feel as if no one can keep them from scoring, but the way that defense struggles, if a team can force 2 or 3 punts or even score off of a turnover, they can be beaten. As it is, that has not happened yet, keeping them in the driver's seat in the Pac-12 and moves them from 6 to 5 this week. I feel as if it was just yesterday when I labeled this team the Noles of old. But 2 weeks in a row, you need an overtime to beat a 1-win Boston College and a winless versus Power 5 school in Clemson. Much like USC, they're still winning despite everything. But they do fall this week from 4 all the way down to 6. I know, Nindy Lion fans, I can hear it now. What more do you want from us? 7 again this week? Well, what I want to see is to see you beat Ohio State in 3 weeks. A dominant win last week versus Iowa, and I have nothing negative to say about it. But everyone ahead of you has a big win against teams that are way better than Iowa, except maybe Georgia. But to be the champ, you have to beat the champ. And until then, keep doing what you're doing, and that number will get smaller. The first 2 out, Washington moves up, and Oregon joins them. Now, let's take a look at each team's matchup for Saturday. It's the 121st matchup between the Bulldogs and the Tigers. Georgia is a 2-touchdown favorite for their first road game of the season. Auburn is 3-1 under new head coach Hugh Freeze. The Tigers have shown some promise with a road win in California, week 2, but took a step back last week with their loss at Texas A&M. Last week, Auburn allowed 7 sacks and only had 56 yards passing. Georgia struggled getting pressure on the UAB quarterback a week ago. I expect the Dogs' defense to get after it this week with an Auburn team that has allowed 12 sacks through 4 games. Peyton Thorne has gotten the most reps for Auburn, but all 3 quarterbacks have recorded game time this season. It's mainly been a run-focused offense with 10 touchdowns rushing compared to 5 passing for the Tigers. Georgia averages allowing 87 yards and 2 touchdowns per game so far. It should be a tough night for Auburn on the ground. I've talked about the Dogs' first half struggles all season. While they've outscored their opponents in the first quarter, it's only been 17-7. While Auburn is averaging 24 points in the first half at home in their 2 games this season. Don't forget, just 2 weeks ago, Against South Carolina, Georgia was down 14-3 at the half. Jordan Hare will be rocking for this 3:30 kickoff. All that to say I expect Georgia to continue its win streak and push it to 7 in a row with a 31-17 victory. The road tripping continues as Michigan travels to Lincoln, Nebraska. The Cornhuskers and first-year head coach Matt Rule are running a throwback offense this year. The I formation are reminders of times past where Nebraska used to pound teams to death with the rush. Nebraska is 2-2 but on a 2-game win streak and relying heavily on that rush, averaging 234.8 yards per game compared to just over 124 passing. If the Cornhuskers expect to have any success running against the Wolverines, that on average only allows about 80 rushing yards per game, they'll need to have more than just a few of those option plays that they've used so far this season. The Nebraska defense will have its hands full with a pass-happy Michigan team that averages over 230 yards and 165 yards on the ground, with two really good and two very reliable running backs in Blake Corum and Donovan Edwards. J.J. McCarthy should have another big day passing as he'll look to add to his 900-plus yards and 8 touchdowns on the season. Michigan should easily cover the 18-point spread, getting the win 34-9. There is no better time to take your bye week than after a 60-minute slugfest, defensive slugfest that is. Look for the Buckeyes to be recovering and working on their game plan for what should be an undefeated Maryland team next week led by Talia Tungavailoa. Expect them to use the Terrapins game tape this week as they take on Indiana, which was the Buckeyes' Week 1 opponent. The Big 12 is down to 3 unbeaten teams, and then there were 2. Well, after this game, assuming that Oklahoma handles Iowa State, that is. Texas is favored by more than 2 touchdowns and leads this series 17-4. This will be the toughest test at quarterback for the Longhorns this season. Jason Daniels brings poise with touch and mobility. Daniels will have to make quick and correct decisions versus a Texas team that has 12 total sacks on the season. So far this year, he's 56 of 75, 705 yards, and 5 touchdowns with only 1 interception. He's 4th on his team in rushing with 74 yards on 27 carries. The Jayhawks defense has scored 2 touchdowns and forced 7 turnovers. 2 years ago, Daniels and Kansas shocked the Longhorns 57-56 in an overtime win in Austin. I don't expect anything near that this year. Kansas is overmatched and untested enough to pull off the upset. Look for a higher scoring game somewhere in the mid-30s for each team, which is both teams' average, and Kansas is about 2.5 points higher than Texas. Look for another huge ranked versus ranked win for Texas on national television, 37-31. Texas needs this win to continue their push for a CFP berth. The only remaining ranked team left on their schedule is that aforementioned unbeaten Oklahoma Sooners, who they face off with next week in the Red River rivalry. Say that 3 times fast. Colorado is looking for a bounce-back game after that beatdown last week in Eugene. I expect Coach Prime to have an offensive game plan that will utilize Shadir Sanders' strength. Sanders has over 1,400 yards on the season. He's 130 of 169, 11 touchdowns to 1 pick. But can the Buffalo's offensive line hold up? They've allowed 23 sacks already, 22 of which are on Sanders. The USC defense is vulnerable, allowing over 364 yards per game, 228 of which is through the air. They also have 16 sacks. 2 interceptions, and 4 fumble recovered. I'm not even going to begin to talk about the Buffalo's defense. They've given up close to 5 fields on average, so I expect Caleb Williams to feast once again. Both teams are going to score. Unfortunately, I think USC is going to give up way too many points to a team that only scored once last week. But in the end, it's hard to say this, but I think the USC defense will come up with more stops than Colorado, with the Trojans winning a shootout, 56-45. Florida State needs to use this week to refocus and regain that dominance that they had in week 1 and 2. The Noles have dealt with the injury bug already this season, so this week should allow for some extra treatment and recovery. I'm sure they'll keep their eye on how Virginia Tech plays this week versus Pitt and preps for the Hokies next week. Penn State is favored big in this Big Ten matchup. Northwestern is 2-2, coming off a 21-point fourth quarter comeback win in overtime against Minnesota. So they're riding a high, but not high enough to upset the 4-0 Nittany Lions. Both teams are averaging exactly 239.8 yards passing, while Penn State has 210 on the ground, and the Wildcats only have 98 per game. With the Penn State defense being tough, 81.5 yards per game tough, Northwestern will have to be very good in the passing game if they want to compete, let alone pull off a monumental upset. 1996 was the last time that the Wildcats beat a 6th team or higher in AP rankings, and that team was Michigan. Penn State is second in the Big Ten in rushing, while Northwestern is the league's worst, allowing 184.5 yards per game. Look for the Nittany Lions to run it all night, using the play action with a few deep passes to soften up what is already a weak run defense. Another big win for Penn State this week, 30-10. Now for my first 2 out. The Huskies are playing an Arizona Wildcats team that was down 17-14 to Stanford heading into the 4th a week ago, outlasting the Cardinals for a 21-20 win. Arizona is 3-1 with their only loss to Mississippi State on the road. Arizona Stadium will be rocking for the West Coast primetime match. Arizona has questions at quarterback with their starter injured a week ago, which could spell doom for a team averaging 30-ish points per game when the team across the field is putting up close to 50 points per game. Last season, Washington went on the road 4-0 for its first time in Pac-12 play in Week 5 as well. Unlike last year, the Huskies will continue their unbeaten season. The Ducks traveled to Stanford to take on a heartbroken Cardinals team after last week's near victory. Oregon should cruise to 5-0 with Bo Nix putting up big numbers against a team that allows over 300 yards passing per game. Don't expect the Ducks to be peeking ahead to next week's huge Oregon at Washington matchup. They'll use this week to build on the momentum of last week's dominant win. Now, for what my playoff picture looks like for Week 5. Nothing has changed this week. Each team here is set up nicely as of the start of Week 5 to win their conference and to go on and play for the Natty. Thanks for tuning in for my preview this week. Come back next week as I wrap up the weekend's actions. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for notification. You can find me on all social media at JP21Sports. I'll see you next time.